land of stone, oh land of flame, you bore the price of Rome's own name.
In the spring of 146 BCE, the city of Corinth wakes to a calm morning on the Aegean coast. Its marble streets hum with merchants. Its temples echo with the prayers of priests. Children laugh in the sunlit courtyards. Ships dock at the harbor, their sails full of spice, silk, and hope. The skies are clear. The gods are pleased. And most importantly, the treaty with Rome still stands. Rome had promised peace. Rome had sworn under seal and senate that Corinth would remain untouched. But before the next moonrise, that promise would be drowned in blood. Corinth would cease to exist. Its citizens, men, women, children, cut down or chained and sold like cattle. Its golden statues torn from altars, its libraries turned to ash, its sacred temples broken open like tombs. The screams of slaughter would echo through its colonnades. Its flames would light the sea. And the army that did it wasn't a horde of savages. It was the world's most disciplined force. Rome, the Republic, the so-called bearers of order and civilization. The city that once rivaled Athens in beauty and Sparta in defiance was erased with brutal precision, not by barbarian hordes, but by the self-proclaimed guardians of civilization. Why? Why did Rome annihilate a city it had vowed to protect? Was it revenge for defiance, a calculated show of power, or was it something darker, an imperial addiction to domination that no oath could restrain? This isn't just the story of Corinth's destruction. It's the story of a civilization betrayed, of a promise twisted into a trap, of peace used as a weapon, sharp, silent, and final. Because Rome didn't just erase a city, it erased the idea that peace with empire meant survival. And the message it sent was carved in fire, on stone, and in the bones of the dead. Defy us once, and we will show the world what mercy really means. What made Corinth such a threat? How did a cultural jewel become a corpse? And how did the city that helped shape Greece's golden age become a ghost that still haunts Rome's legacy? Historians call it a tragedy. But for the survivors, if any could be called that, it was the end of the world as they knew it. And for Rome, it was just another victory. Before we go into that history buried under sand, ash, and silence, stories that were never meant to survive, subscribe to Unique History Alive. Because here, the dead don't just whisper, they scream their truth. On this channel, we don't just tell you what happened. We show you why it mattered, who hid the truth, and what the world lost when history was rewritten. From blood-stained temples to banned scrolls, from warrior queens whose names were burned from memory, to emperors erased by their enemies. We breathe life into the past, one uncovered secret at a time. Long before the fires of Rome consumed it, Corinth was already a legend, positioned on the narrow Isthmus of Corinth. It was the gateway between mainland Greece and the Peloponnesian Peninsula, a strategic and economic jewel. Its harbors, Lycaeum on the Corinthian Gulf and Cenchreae on the Saronic Gulf, gave it twin faces, one toward the west, the other toward the east. Goods from across the ancient world passed through its ports: ivory from Africa, silk from the east, wines from Italy, and olive oil from Athens. It wasn't just geography, it was genius. By the 7th century BCE, Corinth had emerged as one of the most advanced city-states of the Greek world. Its artisans developed the Corinthian order, a style of architecture so ornate and refined that Rome itself would later steal it, replicate it, and plaster it across its empire. Its streets shimmered with mosaics, Its fountains whispered mythology in stone, and its wealth was almost unspeakable. But wealth brings envy, and power invites fear. Corinth stood at the heart of Greece, and it stood proud. It refused to be swallowed by greater empires without a fight. First Persia, then Macedon, then Rome. When Philip II of Macedon began his conquest of Greece in the 4th century BCE, many cities fell into submission or ruin, but not Corinth. It became a military stronghold, a Macedonian garrison town, and yet its spirit remained defiantly Greek. After Alexander the Great's death, as his empire fractured into chaos, Corinth once again became a city of diplomacy and power brokering. It joined and left leagues. It hosted assemblies. It was never just a pawn, it was a player. Then came the rise of Rome. At first, Corinth tried to coexist. The Roman Republic was still a foreign power. Ambitious, yes, but distant. The Greek city-states, weary and broken from centuries of war and infighting, found themselves caught in the rising tide of Roman expansion. Some cities surrendered. Some resisted. Corinth, it walked a dangerous middle path. It joined the Achaean League, a confederation of Greek city-states, united against external control. For decades, the League had been Rome's reluctant ally. But as Roman demands grew heavier, taxes, garrisons, submission, tensions rose. Corinth, wealthy and influential, became one of the loudest voices of defiance. Rome in the 2nd century BCE was no longer just a regional Italian power. It was an empire in all but name. Having crushed Carthage in the west and Macedon in the east, the Roman Senate turned its gaze on the Greek world, not with curiosity, but with calculation. Greece, once the cultural heart of the world, was now a fractured collection of proud but vulnerable states. Rome offered them protection. Rome offered them trade. But Rome also demanded obedience. What it didn't tolerate was contradiction. The Roman Senate wanted stability. Corinth offered resistance. And resistance, no matter how diplomatic, no matter how justified, would eventually be branded rebellion. Still, in 147 BCE, Corinth was not at war with Rome. There was no active invasion, no siege, no official declaration of conflict. In fact, the Roman Senate had explicitly forbidden its generals from attacking the city. Corinth had sent envoys. Talks were underway. There was still time. There was still peace. But peace, in Rome's hands, was a fragile lie. One that could be shattered by the flick of a senator's hand, or the ambition of a single general. Tension in the air. As the Achaean League grew bolder in its demands for autonomy, Rome began laying the groundwork for punishment. Corinth, as one of the League's most prominent cities, quickly became a symbol of that defiance, and thus, a target. In the Senate halls, there were debates. Some senators called for diplomacy, others called for discipline. But far from the marble steps of Rome, in the fields of Macedonia, a ruthless Roman general named Lucius Mummius was preparing his legions, not for peacekeeping, but for war. He would follow orders on the surface. He would march south, fly the Roman standard, and negotiate. But what Mummius brought was not negotiation. It was annihilation wrapped in command. So when the Roman Senate promised Corinth peace, they weren't lying. They simply hadn't finished defining what peace meant. The years leading up to Corinth's destruction were not quiet. They were boiling. Rome had won its wars against Carthage, against Macedon, against the Seleucids. But victories abroad bred arrogance at home, and nowhere was that arrogance more visible than in Rome's treatment of Greece. To Roman senators, Greece was a museum, beautiful, educated, but outdated. They admired its philosophers, copied its statues, looted its scrolls, but they no longer respected its autonomy. To Rome, Greece had become a servant, useful, cultured, but ultimately submissive. Corinth refused to play that role. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Achaean League was the last flickering hope of Greek unity. Led by cities like Corinth, Argos, and Thebes, it sought to preserve the dignity of Greece in a world now ruled by Roman swords. Corinth, the League's most powerful and wealthy member, was not merely symbolic, it was the beating heart of the resistance. At its helm stood Critolaus, an Achaean statesman and general, whose voice thundered through the Greek world like a war drum. To Rome, Critolaus was a fanatic. To many Greeks, he was a hero. He called for independence. He denounced Roman interference in Greek politics. He warned that peace with Rome was a leash disguised as friendship. But Critolaus was not a soldier. He was a politician driven by pride and desperation, and he failed to understand just how far Rome was willing to go to silence defiance. When the League began refusing Roman envoys, resisting Roman orders, and imprisoning Roman-aligned citizens, Rome prepared to act. Not through the Senate floor, but through steel and fire. Lucius Mummius, a consul with no political finesse, but a reputation for merciless efficiency, was given command of the Roman legions. His orders were simple: restore order in Greece. The phrase was ambiguous, deliberately so. What order meant would be decided by the man holding the sword. In early 146 BCE, Mummius marched south with nearly 30,000 troops, veteran legionaries who had crushed Carthage months earlier, their blades still wet from empire building. They moved swiftly through central Greece, shattering what little resistance stood in their way. The Achaean League responded in chaos. Corinth, hastily fortified, became the League's final stronghold. The city buzzed with feverish activity. Stone walls were reinforced, old soldiers were summoned, temples were emptied of silver and bronze to fund the defense. Farmers became spearmen, priests became quartermasters, women ground grain, packed water, melted heirlooms for the cause. But no alliance came, no city dared join them now. Corinth stood alone. Critolaus, whose speeches had stirred rebellion, had fled and possibly died. Leadership fell to others less experienced, more desperate. Still, the spirit of the city refused to break. The people believed they could outlast Rome's siege. After all, hadn't they survived worse? Didn't they have the favor of the gods? But the gods were silent. Mummius encircled the city. No ultimatums, no declarations. Corinth was already condemned. He let fear and starvation do their work. Then, after days of dread, the attack began. Corinth's defenders fought valiantly. The narrow city gates funneled Roman forces into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Flaming oil rained from the walls, slings cracked bone, but Roman engineering and discipline were unstoppable. Legionaries built ramps. They brought siege engines. They launched flaming boulders into the markets and homes. One by one, Corinth's outer defenses collapsed. At dawn, the final breach came. Roman troops poured into the city like a flood of iron. What followed was not conquest. It was obliteration. The city burned. Entire neighborhoods were set alight. The temples of Aphrodite and Apollo were gutted and looted. Priests were slaughtered where they knelt. Women were raped. Children were dragged screaming from their homes, shackled and thrown into pens like livestock. Corinth's wealth, its famed bronzes, its libraries, its heirlooms of centuries, was seized or destroyed. The sacred statues of gods and heroes were carted away or smashed to dust. Soldiers, drunk on blood and plunder, danced in fire-lit ruins. Mummius gave only one command: spare no man. And they didn't. It took days for the fires to die down. By then, the city was little more than charred bones and silence. Survivors, mostly women and children, were marched in chains across the Greek countryside, sold to slavers who waited like vultures behind Roman lines. Corinth had not just been defeated, it had been erased. And yet, there had been no official war, no Senate proclamation of hostilities. Rome would later claim Corinth had provoked them. that the city's leaders had been irrational, that such destruction was unfortunate but necessary. But the truth was clear to anyone who stood on the blackened stone where Corinth once lived. This was punishment. This was a message. Back in Rome, Mummius was not condemned. He was celebrated. He returned home to triumph, his chariot rolling through streets lined with cheering crowds. Behind him marched lines of chained Corinthian captives. Before him were carts overflowing with Greek treasures, statues, scrolls, weapons, gold. The Senate applauded. They called it a righteous act, an act of order. But beneath the ceremony, something darker stirred, a realization. Rome was no longer a republic of laws and diplomacy. Rome had tasted total annihilation and liked it. So Corinth fell, not because it was weak, not because it was wrong, but because it refused to kneel, and Rome could not tolerate that. When Corinth fell, the world changed, not with a declaration, not with a treaty, but with a silence so total, it seemed even the gods had turned their backs. The streets, once lined with laughter and lyres, were now soaked in blood. The statues of the gods stood shattered. Temple columns collapsed like corpses. Smoke hung over the ruins like a funeral shroud, seen by sailors from miles out to sea. This was not just the end of a city, it was the death of Greek independence, and the birth of a new kind of Roman rule. In the weeks following the destruction, Corinth no longer existed as a place, only as a lesson. Rome made sure of that. The city's ruins were left untouched, a deliberate scar, a monument to obedience through fear. No one was allowed to rebuild. No one was allowed to return. Its soil was declared sacred, sacred not to the gods, but to the message it carried. This is what happens to those who speak when told to be silent. Corinth's surviving citizens, those not butchered or raped or marched away in chains, disappeared into history, their names forgotten, their homes wiped from the map. The elite were paraded in Roman triumphs, like exotic animals. Artists, scholars, priests, children, their lives became prizes of war. And what of the Achaean League? The dream of unity, the defiance, gone. Rome dissolved the League with a single decree. Cities that had once stood shoulder to shoulder now scrambled to prove their loyalty, terrified they might be next. The spirit of Greek autonomy, a fire kindled through centuries of struggle against Persia, Macedon, and even themselves, was extinguished overnight. In Rome, Lucius Mummius became a paradox. He was hailed as a conqueror, given a triumph, draped in laurel. Statues were carved in his honor. He had done what no other Roman general dared. He had tamed the Greek heartland with a single, overwhelming strike, and yet he was no visionary. Mummius was a blunt instrument, a servant of Senate orders. He had no love for slaughter, no lust for culture, no deeper understanding of the civilization he had just erased. In fact, when shipping looted statues back to Rome, he famously told his men, "If you break them, make sure to replace them." To him, Corinth's glory was measured in tons of bronze, and Rome's message, delivered. Across the Greek world, a cold understanding settled in Rome did not negotiate with identity. It allowed subservience. It allowed tribute. It even allowed culture, but only when declawed and rebranded. But the moment a people asserted themselves, spoke with their own voice, declared their own worth, Rome would crush that voice under the heel of a legionary boot. Corinth became a myth in real time. Whispers filled the Aegean. Have you heard what happened? They burned the temples. They enslaved the priests. The statue of Aphrodite was melted for coins. Greece, once the teacher of Rome, now sat beneath its student's sword, and the lesson was clear. You are not equals. You are examples. Revolution? There was none. And yet, no great rebellion rose. No mass uprising stormed Roman outposts. Why? Because Corinth had shown them all what would come next, and that fear did what armies could not. It turned cities into subjects, citizens into clients, proud democracies into prefectures. Some historians say the destruction of Corinth planted the seeds of future revolts, that it festered in Greek memory for generations, but not in the moment. In the moment, it broke them. The world blinked, and Rome became permanent. The sack of Corinth did more than end the Greek resistance. It marked a turning point in how Rome ruled. Before Corinth, Rome still pretended. It still played the part of the reluctant conqueror. The Republic had laws. It had procedure. It used diplomacy and slow encroachment. It offered peace before war. But after Corinth, Rome embraced a darker truth. Power didn't require explanation, only demonstration. Corinth was that demonstration, and in the same year, 146 BCE, Rome did something else. In the west, its legions burned Carthage to the ground after a third and final war. That city too was annihilated, salted, flattened, erased. Two great cities, two ancient powers, destroyed within the same year. It was not coincidence. It was transformation. In Athens, philosophers wept. In Rhodes, poets wrote laments. In Delphi, the oracles went silent for weeks. Because Corinth had not just been a Greek city, it had been a symbol of resistance, and now it was dust. One letter from the period, attributed to a traveler in the aftermath, read, "I walked where there were once libraries, now bone piles. I saw altars blackened with blood. I found no gods, only smoke." The emotional collapse was not confined to Greeks. Even some Romans were shaken. Corinth's destruction had a chilling clarity. Rome could do anything now, and it would. From that moment forward, oppression became institutional. Rome no longer needed to couch its expansion in alliances. It began seizing, absorbing, restructuring. Governors replaced local councils. Latin replaced Greek in official halls. Taxes were increased. Temples were co-opted. Dissidents disappeared in the night. The Pax Romana, the famed Roman peace, was born not through diplomacy, but through the fear of another Corinth. Corinth was the crucifix of empire, a public death meant to silence millions. What collapsed in 146 BCE was not just a city. It was an entire way of being, a civilization that believed beauty, thought, and trade could protect it. A people who believed a treaty meant trust. A culture that believed power had limits. And Rome, rising from the ashes, no longer believed any of that. For over a century after its destruction, Corinth remained dead. The land where it stood was declared cursed, a sacred wasteland. The ruins were not cleared. They were left to rot, deliberately, defiantly, as a symbol of what happens to cities that challenge empire. Travelers passed in silence. Superstitions grew. Children were told not to speak its name. And across Greece, the message held: Rome had erased Corinth, and could erase anyone. But empires do not let prime real estate lie fallow forever. And in time, even the most brutal ruin becomes a convenient blank slate. In 44 BCE, just over a century after its annihilation, Julius Caesar, newly declared dictator for life, issued a decree. Corinth would rise again, but not as the city it once was. This new Corinth was a Roman colony, Colonia Las Ulia Corinthiensis, a gesture of Caesar's benevolence and a strategic investment in Greece's future under Roman control. Where temples had once stood, forums were built. Where Greeks had prayed to Aphrodite and Apollo, Romans now worshipped Venus and Mars. The new settlers were not descendants of Corinth's dead. They were veterans of Roman campaigns, retired soldiers rewarded with land, foreigners, colonizers. Their language was Latin, their customs Roman, their loyalties imperial. The soil was still Greek, but the heartbeat was Rome's. Over the next decades, Corinth was reborn, not as a bastion of Greek independence, but as a showcase of Roman dominance. Aqueducts, amphitheaters, basilicas, Roman walls, Roman statues, Roman law. It was cleaner, stronger, wealthier, but it was not Corinth. Not in spirit, not in soul. What Rome had once destroyed in a blaze of vengeance, it now reconstructed in the image of its own glory. Erasure followed by reinvention. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was imperial strategy. But cities are not just stone, they are memory, and memory lingered. Even in rebuilt Corinth, whispers of the past remained. Ruins from the old city still peeked through the soil. Local myths resurfaced. Hidden mosaics were unearthed, and in the hearts of Greeks, the original Corinth lived on, as martyr, as warning, as symbol. Over time, Roman officials learned to co-opt that memory, too. Corinth's past glories were celebrated in art, now adorned with Roman banners. Its heroes were written into Roman histories, now framed as arrogant, foolish, doomed to fail without Rome's guidance. Its tragedy was retold, not as a sin, but as a lesson in civilization. Rome had burned Corinth. Now Rome claimed to have saved it. The new Corinth thrived materially. By the 1st century CE, it was once again one of the richest cities in Greece. Traders flowed through its harbors. Philosophers lectured in its halls. Tourists admired its theaters. But something was missing. There was no soul in its revival. Only strategy. There was no defiance. Only compliance. The new Corinth wore its past like a shadow too dangerous to name, too powerful to erase. Even in Roman times, visitors spoke of an eerie tension in the streets, as if the city knew what had been done to it. In the 1st century CE, Corinth gained new fame, this time as a crucible of early Christianity. The Apostle Paul visited the city and wrote 2 famous letters to its fledgling Christian community. His writings reveal a city divided between decadence and despair, between memory and modernity. His words to the Corinthians, still read across the world, speak not just to faith, but to a people still searching for identity in a place built on someone else's bones. The Christian Corinthians were not descendants of the old nobility, but they too felt the weight of living among ruins reborn. Eventually, Corinth's dual identity, destroyed by Rome, revived by Rome, became part of the broader Roman mythos. It was used as proof of Rome's power to both punish and create, to destroy culture and then wear it like a trophy. In the imperial imagination, Corinth was no longer a victim. It was a success story. Look, they said, at what Rome can build, even from ash and bone. But the truth was darker. The Corinth that Rome rebuilt had no memory of itself. Its soul was buried beneath aqueducts, its truth repaved in Roman marble, and what had once been an example of resistance became a tool of propaganda. Rome had promised to spare the city. Then it had destroyed it. Then it brought it back, but only on its own terms, because in the Roman world, even memory could be conquered. Corinth was a city of stone, but in the end, it was a mirror, reflecting the ambitions, fears, and cruelties of every power that touched it. Its destruction was not unique, but the lie that came before it, the promise of mercy, made it unforgettable. Rome didn't just destroy Corinth to win. It destroyed Corinth to prove a point that no one is untouchable, not even a jewel of civilization. And in doing so, it revealed something timeless, something that echoes across centuries, beyond the fall of empires and the rise of new ones. Empires do not kill only with armies. They kill with broken promises. Corinth's fate is still relevant because it embodies the cruel logic of absolute power. Make peace to calm your enemies, then strike when they are least prepared. Destroy not just their bodies, but their memory, their story, their right to be remembered as they were. This strategy didn't end with Rome. We see it repeated again and again through history. From cities razed by colonial conquest to treaties betrayed by modern superpowers, the tactic is the same. Present civility, conceal the sword, And to those on the receiving end, the pain is not only in the destruction, it is in the betrayal of trust that came before it. For centuries, Corinth remained in the shadows, not just physically but spiritually. Yet the memory of what was done to it never truly died. It passed through poets, through travelers, through letters, and finally through scripture. While the city was rebuilt, rebranded, and Romanized, the name Corinth took on a new life in the Christian world. It no longer stood simply for wealth or architecture. It came to symbolize the fragile tension between spiritual growth and worldly corruption. Paul's letters to the Corinthians, preserved in the Bible, are not just theological documents. They are testimonies to a people living in the long shadow of destruction, still struggling to find identity, purpose, and meaning in a world rebuilt over trauma. In that sense, the true legacy of Corinth was never marble. It was moral. The city had been wiped off the map, but somehow it became eternal. In Christian teaching, there is a powerful paradox. That which is broken can be made whole. That which is cast down can be raised. That which is dead can still speak. The letters to the Corinthians echo this theme. They speak to communities fractured by their past. They challenge the arrogance of power and wealth. They call for unity, humility, and moral courage, even in a city shaped by violence. And perhaps that is the final irony. Rome tried to erase Corinth, but Corinth became part of a faith that outlasted Rome, not as a symbol of resistance, but as a symbol of redemption. A city crushed by empire that found voice in scripture. A city betrayed by power that became a lesson in spiritual survival. Today, Corinth is ruins again. Modern excavations reveal temples toppled, markets lost, mosaics faded, but its story remains one of the most haunting examples of betrayal in world history. We inherited the strategy of erasure, the temptation of domination, the moral cost of broken promises, but we also inherited something else: the memory of those who fell, the lessons from their downfall, and the enduring truth that no city, no nation, no people, no matter how grand, are immune to the cold machinery of empire. Corinth trusted the word of a power that saw promises as tactics. It paid with fire, blood, and silence. But its voice was not lost. It rose first in whispers, then in letters, then in scripture, and today it stands not just as a place of ruins, but as a question to every generation that follows. When power speaks of peace, can you trust its silence? What you just watched wasn't just history. It was a voice that refused to be forgotten. And there are so many more waiting to be heard. So if you felt something today, if the past reached out and touched you, then don't let it fade. Subscribe to Unique History Alive and walk with us, one buried truth at a time. Because history isn't dead. It's just been waiting for someone like you.